Tonight on PBS News Weekend, the future of U.S.-China relations as Biden meets with Xi Jinping for the last time in office. Then, severe drought has sparked blazes in a region of the country not used to wildfires.
The Northeast over the last 10 years has been known for its historic flooding, and now we're dealing with a parched and in some areas scorched earth situation. And it's a roll of the dice as to which one it will be at this point.
And the dangerous and sometimes deadly work done by environmental activists around the world.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. And friends of the NewsHour. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Good evening, I'm William Brangham. John Yang is away. Israeli troops have reached their deepest point inside Lebanon since Israel invaded its neighboring nation 6 weeks ago. At least 6 Lebanese were killed, including children, when an Israeli airstrike hit a village in eastern Lebanon. The country's health ministry says 2 medics were also killed in strikes that hit southern Beirut. The IDF maintains the strikes were meant to destroy Hezbollah infrastructure. Displaced residents search through the debris for what's left of their possessions.
One cannot deny that there are memories in that building, memories of my own children. And I really wish that I can actually take one simple picture of them when they were young. I did not take anything outside of that home because I did not expect at all that this will be an Israeli target, not for 1 second.
In the northern Gaza Strip today, an Israeli strike killed at least 10 people living in a school-turned-shelter for displaced families. Gazan health officials say rescue efforts were ongoing to find any survivors still trapped under the rubble. A patient in California is being treated for a new, more serious form of Mpox, a version first seen in eastern Congo. The California Department of Public Health said the patient recently traveled to eastern Africa, but is now being treated at home. Officials say the risk to the public remains low. President-elect Trump is making more cabinet appointments as his transition plows ahead. Late today, he tapped Chris Wright to run the Department of Energy. Wright is currently a fossil fuel executive and was a donor to Trump's campaign. Trump also announced Friday night that Caroline Leavitt will become his White House press secretary. At 27, she'll be the youngest and first person from Generation Z to hold that position. Prosecutors in New York allege that music mogul Sean Diddy Combs is trying to obstruct justice from his jail cell. He's awaiting trial on sex trafficking charges. Filings made late Friday in Manhattan allege that Combs asked family members to reach out to witnesses and to try to sway public opinion. A $50 million bail hearing is scheduled for next week. And the only knockout in last night's Mike Tyson-Jake Paul boxing spectacle was to Netflix's ability to stream a live event. Former heavyweight champ Mike Tyson, who is nearly 60 years old, fought 27-year-old internet star Jake Paul. The much-hyped event was marred when Netflix's feed stalled and glitched for viewers around the world. In the end, Paul beat Tyson by unanimous decision of the judges. Still to come on PBS News Weekend, the role of climate change in the outbreak of wildfires in the Northeast, and the deadly work of environmental activists around the world.
This is PBS News Weekend from the David M. Rubenstein studio at WETA in Washington, home of the PBS NewsHour, weeknights on PBS.
Today in Lima, Peru, President Biden is meeting for the third and final time during his term with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. The leaders of the two superpowers sat down together as President Biden prepares to hand the reins of this tense but consequential relationship back to President-elect Trump. Their sit-down was on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit, known as APEC. Nick Schifrin is there now. Nick, very, very good to see you. Could you tell us a little bit about this meeting? What was the Biden administration's goal here?
U.S. officials described the meeting as an attempt to take stock of their efforts to try and manage the competition between the U.S. and China, including increasing military-to-military communications and working together on fentanyl, AI, and climate. But, William, as you know, the top of the agenda for all of these summits are always where China and the U.S. do not agree. And the top of that list, of course, is Taiwan. Last month, we saw Chinese military practice what they call blockading and assaulting the island in response to a speech by Taiwan's new president, whom Beijing calls a separatist. U.S. officials say that conflict in Taiwan or over Taiwan remains the most significant risk for U.S. and the world. U.S. officials also say that Biden will bring up China's ongoing support for Russia's defense industrial base, which is allowing Russia to continue its efforts in Ukraine. And perhaps most immediately, William, the U.S. is also bringing up what U.S. officials call a Chinese hack of American telecommunications firms that have led to the theft of customer call records, the compromise of at least one phone to an advisor of President-elect Trump, and Chinese being inside the system that those firms have built for law enforcement agencies. William, the U.S. is not expecting any breakthroughs on any of those issues.
And Nick, how do the Chinese respond to those allegations about that hack? And more broadly, what are their goals with this meeting?
The China calls U.S. claims of a hack disinformation. They even accuse the U.S. of inserting computer code to, quote, frame China. Instead, China highlights badly needed infrastructure development here and across the global south, including Xi Jinping's first event here in Peru, inaugurating what will be the second largest port on the Pacific Ocean. China replaced the U.S. as Peru's largest trading partner a decade ago. And the Chinese say Latin America is not, quote, in anyone's backyard. That's a direct dig at the U.S. And Xi Jinping personally ties Latin and Chinese cultures together and says they are the future.
This is my third visit to Peru. The profound accumulation of ancient civilizations has endowed China and Peru with wisdom and broad-mindedness and enabled us to see clearly the direction of history and follow the trend of the times.
The U.S. argues that port is worth a lot less than the $6 billion of foreign direct investment that the U.S. makes in Peru that creates 1.1 million jobs. Biden, though, also warned Peru's president not to accept any, quote, non-transparent deals, and there are concerns about the transparency of the deal over that port. But, William, I spoke to Peru's ambassador in Washington, and he told me that, look, quote, the U.S. needs to pay more attention to the continent. We are receiving interest from other parts of the world. Someone has to make the investment. He acknowledged U.S. concern about China, but said our solution is more American investment, not less Chinese investment. William, South American officials don't necessarily have an affinity for China, but they need Chinese investment.
Nick, as you well know, in 2 months' time, President-elect Trump will take over, inherit all of these issues. Do you have a sense from Trump's nominees thus far how the Trump administration might handle China?
Trump himself has warned that he will impose a 60% tariff on all Chinese goods, and that will spark Beijing to retaliate and perhaps create a trade war. As for those picks, William, they are very, very important. Trump's pick for Secretary of State, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, has long called for militarily and economically tougher posture on China. Beijing's actually sanctioned him twice, and so they would need to lift those sanctions if the Secretary of State, the U.S.'s top diplomat, were to ever fly into China. Trump's pick for National Security Advisor, Mike Waltz, has said the U.S. is in a Cold War with the Chinese Communist Party. So all that suggests that the second Trump administration will be as confrontational as the first Trump administration was at the end of that administration But, William, we saw tension between the pro-business and the national security crowd in the first Trump administration, and perhaps we will see it again. One example, Elon Musk, the world's richest man, a senior advisor, essentially, to President-elect Trump. He is very close to Chinese leaders and creates Teslas in China. And so we will see what that tug and pull ends up with in the new administration.
Nick, this being the last meeting between Xi and Biden, is there any sense of any aspects of the Biden administration's efforts that will endure beyond his term?
U.S. officials certainly hope so, and they cite one example during the Trump administration, which expanded the Quad, that is the Japan, U.S., India, and Australia, and have really increased the amount of cooperation between those four countries. And they believe that they have created an institutionalized relationship between the United States, Japan, and South Korea. And they predict that the Trump administration will expand on that, as Secretary of State Antony Blinken said here in Peru.
We reimagined, we re-energized, we revitalized, we strengthened, and we wove together our alliances and partnerships in new ways to try to advance an increasingly shared vision for a future that's more free, more open, more secure, more prosperous, more resilient, more connected.
It's those relationships that both the Trump administration and the Biden administration have used to try and respond to China's aggressiveness in the region. But, William, whether any Biden administration efforts survive the Trump administration is, of course, going to be up to the new team.
That is our Nick Schifrin in Lima, Peru. Nick, great to see you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
During their meeting today, Xi told President Biden that China's goal of a stable, healthy relationship with the U.S. is unchanged following the presidential election. She said he is, quote, ready to work with the incoming Trump administration and to, quote, manage differences to benefit both nations. For years, wildfires across the American West have served as an urgent reminder of the threat posed by extreme weather, which is often made worse by climate change. But over the last few weeks, nearly 3,000 miles across the country, fires have engulfed parts of the Hudson Valley, stretching between New York and New Jersey, sending smoke into New York City, reducing air quality, and turning the skyline a hazy gray. Often driven by high winds, the nearly 5,000-acre Jennings Creek fire has gained ground because of an unusually severe drought that's occurring on the East Coast. Hillary Howard is a climate change reporter for the New York Times. Hillary, thank you so much for being here. I mentioned how this region is in the middle of an awful drought, but how did this fire initially start and how did it get so bad?
We don't know how the fire initially started because it is in an area that's quite rugged and mountainous, and firefighters have simply been trying to contain the blaze over the past week so that it doesn't spread further. They're not able to get into the source of it because it's so impassable, but the cause is still under investigation.
As many people know, this is not a region that is used to wildfires. Do they have the fire crews and the personnel to attack this as needed?
From what I understand, it's all hands on deck. Volunteer firefighters are joining up with state professionals, emergency workers, Marine crews have filled in, but it's taking everyone with any sort of training at this point to help with these fires.
I know that this is also a big agricultural area, and some of my colleagues recently talked with a farmer down there, a man named Rocky Hazelman, who's a farmer in West Milford, New Jersey. Here's what he had to say about just how dry it is.
So we've seen more than 40 days without real meaningful rain. We had one just a week ago, which kind of gave us a little bit of hope, but nothing since then. The 40 days has dried out both reservoirs, our local pond, and our underground storage tanks where we collect rainwater, but we're finding that we have to turn to the wells now because the surface water has disappeared.
How much has this drought exacerbated this fire?
Dry conditions or a drought, they are the reason for the fire or the reason the fire spreads so rapidly, right? So it starts with global warming. And if you just break it down very simply, the earth is getting hotter, right? So on one end of the spectrum, hot air holds more moisture. So when it rains, it pours and therefore floods. But when there is a high pressure system in place, which is what the situation is in the Northeast right now, and it's impossible to rain, that same hot air sucks up all the moisture from the ground and the vegetation and just makes ready-made fuel for these fires to spread and spread.
And how are people dealing with it? Again, if you're not used to it, if you grew up in California or the Pacific Northwest, you're used to warnings about fires and how to prepare. How have people in this region been dealing with this?
I think we're all learning on the fly. It's really, really important if you're on social media to follow, say, if you're in New York City, the New York City Office of Emergency Management, they put out alerts. You can sign up to get alerts on your cell phone. There are Facebook community groups that alert you to when the air quality will be bad. There's an app that the EPA puts out called Air Now, where you can plug in your zip code and find out if the air is healthy to be outside in. So there are lots of software and internet tricks in order to stay cognizant of what's going on, right? And then in terms of how not to start a fire yourself, is just common sense. I was at a press conference with Governor Phil Murphy the other day, and it sounds really simple, but if you have a wood burning stove or outdoor fire ashes, when you dispose of them, you put them in a closed container. You certainly don't discard of a cigarette outside. You don't hand a lighter over to your child or play with it yourself. You don't mess with fireworks. I mean, it's just common sense at this point. And you certainly don't have a campfire outside right now. It's just, and a burn ban is in place in New Jersey and in New York for that very reason.
What do these wildfires now occurring in the Northeast tell us about the ongoing struggle against climate change?
That it's completely unpredictable. The Northeast over the last 10 years has been known for its historic flooding and its general saturation of the earth. And now we're dealing with a parched and in some areas scorched earth situation. And it's a roll of the dice as to which one it will be at this point.
All right, Hillary Howard of the New York Times, thank you so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
The United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP29, is currently underway in Azerbaijan. Leaders at this year's meeting are being pressed to address, among other things, the rising threats to environmentalists and defenders of human rights. Ali Rogan looks at the challenges facing those activists around the world.
Close to 200 people died defending the environment in 2023. That's according to a new report by Global Witness, a UK-based environmental watchdog and advocacy group. Latin America accounted for 85% of the documented killings, and for a second year in a row, Colombia is the most dangerous place for activists. But experts say the lack of data from other parts of the world is obscuring a more pervasive trend.
Filipino environmental defenders are experiencing various forms of attacks, such as from terrorist tagging, vilification, surveillance, intimidation, up to abduction, killings, and having trumped-up charges.
To do this kind of work, I don't feel safe at all in South Africa, because there is quite a lot of the death threats that is pointing on me. Now, those death threats, I know that are not just empty threats, are real, because I've already experienced our comrades being assassinated in the struggle of defending the land.
I have a very good close friend who's been, in and out of court because she was defending her area from being logged, and slap is here and there, slapping everybody.
We are being silenced to make sure that you cannot question development. We've been put our lives in line of being killed because of asking that question.
The last green lands are always at the indigenous communities' territories, and we are defending that with our lives. There's been too many negotiations. There are pledges already, but there's just very little action, real action that's done. And for us, the communities, we have very little to say. We are not on the table, negotiation table.
As women environmental defender, we have this additional threat that we feel. Example, when we were abducted, they threatened to sexually assault us.
We need something that can be put place in order to protect the human rights defenders. But if there is no person that is collecting this data, it will be like the life as usual.
Laura Furones is a senior advisor at Global Witness and the lead author of the report. Laura, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, let's talk about the killings in Latin America, particularly Colombia. What do we know about those murders there?
Well, what we know is that for 12 years now, ever since Global Witness started recording murders around the world, Colombia has continued to emerge as one of the most dangerous countries, if not the most dangerous. Our data in 2023, in fact, tells us that Colombia is country number one, with 40% of all global killings recorded in just that one single country. So obviously a very alarming sort of background of violence in the country that defenders have to suffer day in and day out.
And we mentioned that many of those defenders are Indigenous persons and women. Why do they tend to be such a large majority of these killings?
Well, Indigenous peoples in particular are disproportionately attacked. And that, again, is true every year. Obviously, Indigenous peoples are quite literally at the front line of the defense. They're trying to protect the territories, the natural resources that often in places that are really far away from any, protection from the state. There's invasions of the lands. Every year, around between 40 and 45% of killings are of Indigenous peoples, which is quite telling given that they only make up 5 to 6% of the global population. And, in terms of women are also subject to really vicious violence because they have to endure all the attacks that their male counterparts suffer, but also gender-specific violence, obviously including sexual violence, harassment, threats to the families, and so on.
One of the features of this report is that there are parts of the world that simply do not report these data in detail. What do we know about those parts of the world, specifically countries in Africa and Asia?
Well, the problem is precisely what we don't know about them. And, our data shows that 85% of the global killings happened in Latin America. That obviously speaks to a very clear reality of violence in the region. But that doesn't mean at all that being a defender in Africa or Asia is any safer. In fact, we're really worried about growing trends of, attacks, but also criminalization and other forms of reprisals. And it's really hard to access data for all sorts of reasons. It's hard to document the cases when, people trying to do so may be risking their own lives.
And what needs to change about the protection of these defenders? Are there any countries in which protections exist?
There are protection mechanisms in many countries, but sadly, the large majority of them are not working as effectively as they should be working. In fact, a substantial number of our killings that we record happened to defenders who were under some kind of protection mechanism that obviously didn't work. So we do need those mechanisms really badly, but we also need them to be effective and so on, because otherwise what we're seeing is that they're sadly not preventing the loss of lives.
The environmentalists we talked to said that conferences like COP are unlikely to change any of their realities, and that often their voices are missing from negotiations. Do you agree with that? And what needs to change?
Well, we have been very actively advocating for an increased presence of Indigenous peoples, Afro-descendants, local communities, because I would agree that for way too long they've been sidelined. We've treated all the knowledge as, something that is a nice to have thing rather than something that really is at the forefront of of everything we know about the climate change. We also know that, and science has told us very clearly that Indigenous peoples live in areas that have better conservation outcomes than any other areas. So obviously it's them who should be leading us into fighting this climate change.
And what can countries like the United States do to add pressure here?
The US has a very important role to play in protecting defenders. On the one hand, because they have the power to legislate, and they have the power to legislate what US companies are doing abroad. often what we see is that attacks happen when companies sort of invade lands or come into lands without any consultation or consent from local communities. So the US government has a really powerful and important role to play in terms of regulating. They also have the ability of protecting defenders through all sorts of mechanisms that they can put in place. Anything from taking, sort of taking defenders into the US when they need some respite and when they're in immediate threat, to working together with all the other sort of global north countries to make sure that corporate behavior is not what we've seen for way too long.
Laura Furones with Global Witness, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for having us.
And that is our program for tonight. I'm William Brangham. For all of my colleagues, thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you tomorrow.
Major funding for PBS News Weekend has been provided by
Consumer Cellular. This is Sam. How may I help you? This is a pocket dial. Well, somebody's pocket. Thought I'd let you know that with Consumer Cellular, you get nationwide coverage with no contract. That's kind of our thing. Have a nice day.
and with the ongoing support of these individuals and institutions. This program was made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
You're watching PBS.